You want to understand power? Watch what happens when a man who controls everything finally loses the one thing he refused to fight for. The carriage wheels cut through frozen mud like a knife through scar tissue. Lady Seraphina Vale pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, watching Blackthorn Manor emerge from the skeletal trees like a monument to everything she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. The estate looked larger than memory allowed, its gray stone walls absorbing the winter light until the entire structure seemed carved from the same bitter cold that had killed 3 tenant farmers last week and left their children screaming into snow that wouldn't stop falling. Her father was 6 days dead. The debts he'd left behind would take 6 lifetimes to repay. And the man who now owned every stone, every servant, every frozen inch of the land her family had held for 2 centuries was the same man who'd promised her forever and then disappeared like smoke through her fingers. Seraphina had been 17 when Adrian Ashcombe walked away. She was 25 now, and the years between felt like scar tissue that never quite healed right. The carriage lurched over a rut in the road. Her maid, Margaret, steadied the small trunk containing everything Seraphina still owned in this world. 3 dresses, her mother's pearl comb, a book of poetry she should have burned years ago. The manor's front doors opened before the carriage fully stopped. Seraphina watched a line of servants emerge onto the frost-covered steps, their breath forming small clouds in the vicious cold. They stood in perfect formation, backs straight, eyes forward, waiting. For her? For him? She wasn't sure anymore. The footman who opened the carriage door had the practiced expression of someone who'd spent years learning how to see everything and reveal nothing. He helped her down onto steps so cold she felt it through her boots. Margaret followed, clutching the trunk like it contained something more valuable than the ruins of a dead man's daughter. The wind cut across the courtyard with enough force to make Seraphina's eyes water. Or maybe that was something else. She refused to examine it too closely. The butler materialized at the top of the steps. Seraphina recognized him immediately. Mr. Thorne. He'd been young when she last saw him, an under-butler who'd once smuggled extra candles to her room so she could read past dark. Now his hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face had acquired the careful neutrality of someone who served a master nobody dared question. "Welcome home, Lady Seraphina." His voice carried across the frozen courtyard like a eulogy. "The Duke is currently occupied with estate business, but has instructed us to make you comfortable. Your rooms have been prepared." My rooms. Seraphina felt something twist beneath her ribs, as if anything in this place could still be hers. She climbed the steps. The servants parted like water around stone. None of them met her eyes. She remembered some of their faces but couldn't match them to names anymore. 8 years had turned familiar strangers into complete ones. The entrance hall hit her like a physical thing. Nothing had changed. The same dark wood paneling, the same portraits of Ashcombe ancestors glaring down from the walls with expressions that suggested they'd found the world wanting and had the receipts to prove it. The same massive chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling like a constellation of frozen stars. But something was different, wrong. Seraphina couldn't identify it at first. Mr. Thorne gestured toward the grand staircase. "If you'll follow me, my lady. The Duke has ensured your comfort will lack nothing." Seraphina didn't move. "Where is he?" The butler's expression remained perfectly neutral. "His Grace is in the East Wing, attending to correspondence. He asked not to be disturbed until—" "I didn't ask for his schedule." She heard her voice echo off the walls. "I asked where he is." A muscle jumped in Mr. Thorne's jaw. "The East Wing study, my lady. But his Grace was quite specific about—" Seraphina was already moving. Her boots clicked against the marble floor with each step. She heard Margaret's small sound of protest behind her but didn't turn around. The servants watched her cross the entrance hall like they were witnessing an execution in slow motion. The East Wing corridor stretched ahead of her, darker than she remembered. The windows here faced north, catching no direct sunlight even in summer. In winter, they were just expensive ways to let the cold seep in through century-old glass. She found the study door closed. Didn't knock. The room beyond was exactly as brutal as the man who occupied it. Dark wood everywhere, books lining 3 walls from floor to ceiling, a massive desk positioned to catch what little light struggled through the windows. And behind that desk, with his back to the door, stood Duke Adrian Ashcombe. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her entrance at all, just continued reading whatever document he held, his broad shoulders rigid beneath an expensive coat that probably cost more than her father's entire quarterly income used to be. Serafina closed the door behind her with enough force to make the sound carry. Adrian's shoulders tensed, just barely, just enough. I told Thorne I wasn't to be disturbed. His voice hadn't changed, still carried that same low, controlled quality that used to make her feel safe and now just made her want to throw something sharp. State your business quickly, and he turned around. Whatever he'd been about to say died in his throat. Serafina watched 8 years of careful control crack across his face like ice over water that wasn't quite frozen solid. His eyes, still that impossible shade of gray that used to remind her of winter mornings, and now just reminded her of all the promises people make when they're young enough to believe in permanence, widened almost imperceptibly before he locked everything back down behind the mask he'd apparently perfected in the time since he'd ruined her life. Lady Serafina. He set the papers down on his desk with precise, deliberate movements. His hands didn't shake. Of course they didn't. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. My father is dead. She heard how flat her voice sounded, how empty. The roads were clear enough for immediate travel. I saw no reason to delay the inevitable. Something moved behind his eyes, gone too quickly to identify. My condolences on your loss. Adrian remained behind his desk like it could protect him from whatever stood between them. I've made arrangements for your accommodation. You'll find your quarters unchanged and your needs anticipated. The estate, I don't care about my quarters. Serafina took 3 steps into the room, close enough to see the small scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten falling out of a tree when they were children, close enough to notice that he looked exhausted beneath the expensive clothes and aristocratic bearing. When did you buy my father's debts? Adrian's expression remained perfectly neutral. That's not your concern. Wrong answer. She felt fury rising in her chest like floodwater. Try again. When did you buy them? His jaw tightened. 2 years ago. Your father approached me when the situation became untenable. I offered terms. Terms? Serafina laughed, and the sound came out jagged. You offered terms. How generous. Did those terms include waiting for him to die before you collected? I collected nothing. Adrian's voice remained level, but something dangerous moved underneath it. The debts are forgiven. The estate is yours. I've had my solicitor draw up the paperwork transferring everything back to your name. You're welcome to leave whenever you wish. The words hung between them like smoke. Serafina stared at him, at this stranger wearing a face she used to know better than her own. Forgiven. Yes. Why? Because they needed to be. She took another step forward. Adrian didn't move, but she saw his hands curl into fists against the dark wood of his desk. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. His eyes met hers, and she saw nothing in them. No recognition, no regret, just cold, distant politeness. You're free to go, Lady Serafina. You always were. Something snapped inside her chest. Free? Her voice came out louder than intended. You vanished 8 years ago without a word, without a letter, without any explanation at all. My father told me you'd gone to London for business, and then the weeks became months, and then your own servant started looking at me with pity every time I asked when you'd return. And now you've bought everything my family owned, forgiven debts I didn't know existed, and you're telling me I'm free? Adrian's mask didn't crack. If you're looking for an apology, you won't find one here. I'm not looking for an apology. Serafina heard her voice shake and hated herself for it. I'm looking for a reason. One real reason why you destroyed everything between us and then spent 8 years pretending I didn't exist. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Outside the window, snow had begun falling again. Thick, heavy flakes that would bury the roads by nightfall. Adrian turned away from her. Back to his papers. This conversation is over. Thorne will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 8. Your presence isn't required if you'd prefer to avoid further discomfort. Serafina didn't move. Couldn't move. She stood there watching him dismiss her like she was some minor business matter he'd resolved and filed away. The fury in her chest had transmuted into something colder, something that tasted like metal. You're a coward. The words came out quiet, almost conversational. Adrian's back stiffened. You built this entire fortress of money and power and control. She gestured at the room, at the manor beyond it, at everything he'd become. But you're still the same coward who couldn't face me 8 years ago. The only difference is now you have better tailors and more expensive ways to hide. She turned toward the door before he could respond, before she could see if anything she'd said had landed. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke. You should stay away from the West Wing. Serafina glanced back over her shoulder. Adrian hadn't moved, still had his back to her, still sounded like he was discussing weather patterns. Why? Because I said so. She left without another word. The corridor outside felt colder than it had minutes before. Or maybe that was just her. Serafina stood in the semi-darkness, trying to remember how to breathe around the fury lodged in her throat. Margaret materialized from somewhere down the hall. My lady, are you? I'm fine. Serafina heard how unconvincing it sounded. Show me to my rooms. They walked in silence through corridors that felt both familiar and alien. The manor had always been large, but in winter it seemed to expand, the shadows growing longer and colder until the entire structure felt like a mausoleum built to house living ghosts. Margaret stopped outside a door Serafina recognized immediately. No. She shook her head. These aren't... I can't stay in my old rooms. His Grace was quite specific, my lady. Margaret's expression suggested she'd already tried that argument with someone who didn't lose debates. Everything has been prepared exactly as you requested 8 years ago. I didn't request anything 8 years ago. I left. Margaret opened the door. The room beyond stole whatever breath Serafina had managed to recover. Nothing had changed. Her bed with its blue silk curtains, her writing desk positioned to catch morning light, her bookshelf with all the volumes she'd collected as a girl, still arranged in the same order she'd left them. Even the small portrait of her mother remained hanging above the fireplace. But it was more than preservation. Someone had maintained this space, dusted the furniture, changed the linens, kept fresh flowers on the nightstand even in the dead of winter. The fire had been laid and lit recently enough that warmth still radiated from the hearth. This isn't possible. Serafina walked into the room like she was entering a crime scene. Her fingers brushed across the writing desk's surface. No dust, no neglect, just careful, deliberate maintenance. Who did this? Margaret busied herself with the trunk. His Grace gave instructions shortly after he acquired the estate. Your rooms were to remain as you left them. Nothing was to be changed or removed. But why would he? The maid's expression suggested she'd reached the limits of what she felt comfortable discussing. Dinner is at 8, my lady. I'll return beforehand to help you dress. She left before Serafina could ask anything else. Alone in a room that shouldn't exist, Serafina sat down on the edge of her bed and tried to understand what any of this meant. Adrian had bought her father's debts 2 years ago, had maintained her childhood rooms for 8 years, had forgiven everything and offered to return the estate without demanding anything in return, and yet had treated her like a stranger, like someone he barely tolerated, like 8 years of silence had been the natural conclusion to whatever they'd once meant to each other. None of it made sense. Serafina stood and began exploring the room more carefully. Everything was exactly as she remembered, but the preservation felt intentional, deliberate, like a shrine to someone who'd died but whose absence the builder refused to acknowledge. She opened her wardrobe and found it full of dresses she'd left behind. Expensive ones her father had bought during the brief period when the Vale family still had money to waste on unnecessary things. She pulled one out and found it freshly pressed, smelling of lavender and cedar. Someone had been taking care of these clothes for 8 years. The thought made something uncomfortable twist beneath her ribs. She was rehanging the dress when she noticed the door at the back of the wardrobe. Small, easy to miss unless you knew it was there. Serafina had discovered it as a child when she'd been playing hide-and-seek with Adrian and his younger brother. It led to the servant passages, the narrow, hidden corridors that ran through Blackthorn Manor's walls like veins through flesh. Serafina glanced toward her bedroom door, still closed. Margaret wouldn't return for hours. The decision made itself. She slipped into the wardrobe and through the small door beyond. The passage smelled of dust and old wood and something else she couldn't quite identify. Darkness pressed in from all sides, but enough light filtered through cracks in the walls to navigate by. Serafina had spent half her childhood exploring these passages. She still remembered the major routes, how to move through the manor unseen, how to hear conversations that weren't meant for her ears. She moved carefully, trailing her fingers along the wall to maintain her bearing. The passages connected most of the major rooms, allowing servants to move through the house without disturbing their employers. As children, she and Adrian had turned them into their private kingdom. Now they just felt like a map of everything she'd lost. Serafina stopped when she reached the junction that would take her either toward the main wings or down toward the lower levels where the kitchens and storage rooms dominated. She was about to turn back when she heard voices drifting up from below. Two servants talking in the hushed tones people used when discussing things they shouldn't. Don't understand why he keeps it maintained. It's been 8 years. The Duke has his reasons. We're not paid to question them. But the music room? Nobody's allowed in there except him. Once a week he spends an entire evening just sitting in that room like, lower your voice. If Thorne hears you gossiping, you'll be dismissed without references. The voices faded as the servants moved away. Serafina stood frozen in the darkness. The music room. She'd forgotten about the music room. Hadn't thought about it in years. It had been her sanctuary once. The place she'd escaped to when the obligations of being Lord Vale's daughter became too suffocating. Adrian used to find her there, listening to her practice pieces she'd never performed for anyone else. She'd left her mother's piano in that room. The passages didn't connect directly to the music room, but Serafina knew how to get close. She moved through the darkness with increasing confidence, following a mental map drawn in childhood and somehow still accurate despite the years. The passage ended at a small viewing panel, one of several throughout the manor that allowed servants to check if rooms were occupied before entering. Serafina pressed her eye against the crack. The music room lay beyond. Serafina's breath caught. The room was exactly as she'd left it. Her mother's grand piano still positioned beneath the tall windows. The music stand still arranged around it. The chairs where Adrian would sit and listen to her practice still in their places. But it was more than preservation. Fresh candles stood on every surface. The floor had been recently cleaned. Sheet music lay open on the piano as if someone had just been playing. And sitting at the piano, his back to the door, was Adrian Ashcombe. He wasn't playing, just sitting there with his hands resting on the keys like he'd forgotten what they were for. In the candlelight, he looked different, less controlled, more human. His shoulders curved forward in a way that suggested exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. Serafina watched him reach out and play a single note. Middle C. The sound echoed through the empty room before dying into silence. Then he stood and walked out, leaving the candles burning. Serafina remained pressed against the viewing panel long after she heard the door close behind him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt. Adrian preserved the music room, kept it exactly as she'd left it, spent evenings alone in a space that should have meant nothing to a man who'd walked away without looking back. Nothing made sense anymore. She navigated back through the passages to her room and emerged from the wardrobe to find the winter light failing outside her windows. Shadows stretched across the floor like accusations. Margaret returned at 7 to help her dress for dinner. Serafina let herself be managed into one of the preserved dresses, her mind still stuck in that candlelit room watching Adrian sit at her mother's piano like a man conducting a funeral for something that refused to stay dead.
"You look lovely, my lady."
Margaret fastened the last button. "His Grace dines in the formal hall. I'll show you." "I remember where it is." The corridors seemed longer in the evening, colder. Serafina passed servants who bowed and averted their eyes, past rooms she'd once known and now felt alien, past windows that showed nothing but darkness and falling snow. The formal dining hall occupied the manor's southern wing. Serafina paused outside the doors, steeling herself. Inside, Adrian stood at the head of a table set for two. He'd changed into evening clothes that probably cost more than her father's funeral. His expression remained perfectly neutral when she entered. "Lady Serafina." He gestured to the chair at the opposite end of the table, 15 feet away. "Please." She sat. Servants materialized to pour wine and present the first course. The food looked expensive and completely inedible. Adrian picked up his fork with the mechanical precision of someone performing a required task. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory. They're exactly as I left them." His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Just barely." "Yes. Why?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Adrian set down his fork and met her eyes for the first time since she'd entered, because leaving them as they were seemed preferable to the alternative. Which was? Acknowledging that you were gone. The admission landed between them like a grenade. Adrian's expression didn't change, but Serafina saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like regret before he locked it away. "You're not making any sense." Serafina leaned forward. "You left. You disappeared without a word. You can't pretend that preserving my rooms somehow makes that—" "I'm not pretending anything." Adrian's voice remained level, but she heard steel underneath it. "I did what was necessary. The rooms are a consequence of decisions I don't regret making." "What decisions? What possibly could have justified—" He stood abruptly. The servants scattered like startled birds. "This conversation is over." "Adrian—" She stood as well. "Stay out of the West Wing, Lady Serafina." His eyes locked with hers, and she saw something dangerous move behind them, something that looked like desperation. "It's not safe." "Not safe? This is your home. What could possibly be just—" He turned away from her. "Please." The single word sounded like it cost him something to say. "Trust me enough to stay away from the West Wing." He left the room before she could respond. Serafina stood alone among half-eaten expensive food and servants who wouldn't meet her eyes. Outside the windows, the snow continued falling, thick enough now to bury roads, to trap everyone inside this frozen monument to secrets nobody would explain. She left the dining hall without touching her food. The corridors felt different at night, more hostile. Serafina moved through the darkness, her mind churning. Every answer Adrian gave just spawned more questions. Every explanation felt like it was hiding something worse beneath. She found herself walking toward the West Wing. The servants had all vanished to wherever servants went when their employers retreated for the evening. Serafina walked alone through darkness, broken only by the occasional lamp left burning. The West Wing had always been the oldest part of the manor, the section that predated most of the renovations and expansions, cold even in summer. Serafina reached the heavy doors that separated the West Wing from the rest of the house. They weren't locked. Beyond lay another corridor, this one lined with portraits of Ashcombs going back generations, hard faces, unforgiving expressions, the accumulated weight of a family that had survived through ruthlessness and strategic marriages and whatever else aristocrats did to maintain power across centuries. Serafina moved deeper into the wing. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, all closed. She tried the first one, locked. The second, locked. The third opened. The room beyond was empty except for a single portrait hanging above a cold fireplace. Serafina stepped inside to examine it closer. A young woman stared back at her from within the frame, maybe 20, dark hair, gray eyes that suggested intelligence and humor. Beautiful in an understated way that seemed almost out of place among the severe Ashcombe faces that dominated the other portraits. A small plaque beneath the frame read, "Eleanor Ashcombe, 1777 to 1798, 21 years old when she died." Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach. She left the room and continued down the corridor. Tried another door. This one revealed what looked like a study. Books everywhere. Papers scattered across a desk like someone had left mid-sentence. She was about to investigate further when she heard footsteps. Serafina froze. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate, unhurried, someone who knew exactly where they were going. She slipped back into the corridor just as Adrian appeared at the far end. He stopped when he saw her. His expression flattened into something utterly unreadable. "I told you to stay out of the West Wing." His voice carried through the darkness like a verdict. "You told me it wasn't safe." Serafina held her ground. "You didn't explain why. I don't owe you explanations." "Yes, you do." She took 3 steps toward him. "You've preserved my rooms for 8 years, forgiven my family's debts, maintained a music room like a shrine. And now you're acting like I'm some trespasser who shouldn't be asking questions about my own past." "Your past?" Adrian's control finally cracked. Something raw and furious leaked into his voice. "You know nothing about your past, nothing about what your father did, or what I've spent 8 years trying to undo, or—" "Then tell me." The words came out louder than she intended. "Tell me what he did." The silence stretched between them. Adrian's hands curled into fists at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that deadly calm. "Your father threatened to destroy my brother, to have him imprisoned on fabricated charges unless I left and never contacted you again. So I left. And I've spent 8 years making sure that when you inevitably returned, You'd have something left to come back to instead of just ruins and debts, and the aftermath of a man who spent everything protecting his pride. The words hit Serafina like physical blows. You're lying. I wish I was. My father wouldn't. Your father was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. Adrian's eyes burned into hers. He believed I was beneath you, that a duke's second son with no prospects wasn't good enough for Lord Vale's only daughter, so he found the leverage he needed and used it. What leverage? Adrian turned away. Go back to your rooms, Serafina. What leverage? Nothing that matters anymore? Serafina grabbed his arm. He went rigid beneath her touch. Tell me. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face. And for just a moment his mask cracked completely, and she saw the same boy who used to find her in the music room and listen to her play like it was the only thing in the world worth hearing. My brother was involved with the wrong people. Made mistakes. Your father discovered those mistakes and told me that if I didn't disappear, he'd ensure Marcus hanged for treason. The ground felt unsteady beneath Serafina's feet. So you left. So I left. Adrian pulled his arm free gently, and then I built everything I needed to make sure that when you inevitably came back, you'd never have to beg anyone for anything again. But you never explained. You just... I couldn't. Adrian's voice cracked. Don't you understand? If I'd told you the truth, you would have tried to fix it. You would have confronted your father or offered to help Marcus or done something noble and self-destructive. So I left you thinking I was a coward because that was easier than watching you destroy yourself trying to save people who didn't deserve saving. Serafina felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. 8 years. You let me believe for 8 years that you just stopped caring. I never stopped. Adrian's hands were shaking now, not even for a single day. Why do you think I kept your rooms exactly as you left them? Why do you think I spent every winter waiting for your father to finally die so you could come home to something that wasn't completely destroyed? The admission hung between them like something fragile. Serafina opened her mouth to respond when a sound echoed through the corridor behind them. Breaking glass. Shouting. The unmistakable crash of a door being forced open. Adrian's expression shifted instantly. Stay here. What's happening? I said, Stay here. He turned and ran toward the noise. Serafina followed. They emerged into the main entrance hall to find chaos. The front doors hung open. Snow poured in from outside, and standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by 6 armed men, was a nobleman Serafina recognized immediately. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood, her father's former business partner. A man with enough political connections to destroy families and enough legal problems that he should have been in prison years ago. Blackwood smiled when he saw Adrian appear. Your Grace, how kind of you to join us. I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news. He pulled a document from his coat. It seems the Vale estate was sold to me 3 months before your arrangement with the late Lord Vale, which means everything you've done here is invalid. The land is mine, the debts are mine. And Lady Serafina? He looked directly at her. Belongs to me now. Adrian moved faster than Serafina had ever seen him move. He was across the hall before Blackwood finished speaking. His hand closed around the other man's throat and slammed him back against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. That document is a forgery, and we both know it. Adrian's voice had dropped to something barely recognizable. You have 10 seconds to leave before I demonstrate exactly what happens to men who threaten people under my protection. Blackwood wheezed out a laugh. His men raised their weapons. Servants scattered. Your protection? The nobleman's face was turning red. She's not yours to protect anymore, Ashcombe. The estate is mine. Her inheritance is mine. And if she doesn't cooperate... Adrian's fist connected with Blackwood's jaw before he could finish. The hall erupted into violence. Serafina watched Adrian fight like something feral as Blackwood's men converged. Watched servants join the brawl with whatever weapons they could find. Watched her entire world narrow down to the sound of breaking furniture and the sight of the only man she'd ever loved fighting 6 armed soldiers to protect an inheritance that should have meant nothing to either of them. She was still standing frozen when one of Blackwood's men grabbed her arm. Serafina didn't think, just reacted. Her knee came up hard into his groin. He went down cursing. She grabbed a candlestick from the nearest table and swung it at the next man who came close. The weight connected with his skull with a sound that made her stomach turn. He dropped. Adrian appeared beside her, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. His hand found hers. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Run. What? The stables. Take the fastest horse. Ride to Ravenswood and find the magistrate. Show him this. He pressed something into her hand. Paper. Folded. And tell him Blackwood is here with forged documents. Go. Now. I'm not leaving you to... Serafina. His eyes locked with hers. Trust me. She looked at him. At this man who'd sacrificed 8 years to protect her from truths she wasn't ready to hear. Who'd preserved her rooms and her music and her inheritance like keeping the past alive could somehow fix what they'd lost. Then she ran. Behind her, the sounds of violence intensified. Serafina burst through a side door into the courtyard. Snow immediately soaked through her evening clothes. The stables were 50 yards away across open ground. She made it 30 yards before she heard someone behind her. Footsteps. Running. Getting closer. Serafina didn't look back, just ran harder. The stable doors loomed ahead, 20 yards, 10, 5. She crashed through the doors into darkness that smelled of horses and hay, fumbled her way to the nearest stall, found a saddle by touch alone, got it onto a horse she couldn't even see clearly. The footsteps reached the stable entrance. Serafina pulled herself onto the horse's back and kicked hard. The animal exploded out of the stall, straight toward whoever had followed her. A figure dove aside. Serafina caught a glimpse of Blackwood's face twisted in fury before she was past him and out into the storm. The horse beneath her fought the snow, but she drove it forward, toward the tree line, toward escape, toward whatever came next for a woman whose entire world had just revealed itself to be built on secrets and sacrifices she'd never asked for. Behind her, Blackthorn Manor disappeared into the blizzard like a memory dissolving. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, Adrian was fighting alone against enemies who wanted to destroy everything he'd spent 8 years protecting. The horse's hooves tore through snow that had already buried the road. Serafina's hands were numb around the reins, her evening dress soaked through and freezing against her skin. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except the animal's labored breathing beneath her and the knowledge that every second she spent riding away from Blackthorn Manor was another second Adrian spent fighting alone. The document he'd pressed into her hand was wadded inside her bodice, the only warm thing left on her body. Ravenswood sat 3 miles south through forest that looked like something out of a nightmare. Trees bent under the weight of ice, branches cracked and fell without warning. The wind cut through the darkness like it had teeth. Serafina pushed the horse harder. The animal stumbled, caught itself, kept moving because she wouldn't let it stop. She thought about Adrian's face in that moment before she ran. The blood streaming from his temple, the absolute certainty in his eyes when he told her to trust him. Like he'd already decided that protecting her was worth whatever price Blackwood's men would extract from his body. 8 years he'd carried the weight of her father's threats. 8 years he'd built an empire just so she'd have something to return to. And the first night she came back, he was bleeding in his own entrance hall because some bastard with forged documents thought he could take what didn't belong to him. The forest finally opened onto the approach to Ravenswood. Lights flickered in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, signs of civilization that felt alien after the violence she'd just witnessed. Serafina drove the horse straight through the town center. People scattered. Someone shouted. She didn't stop until she reached the building she remembered from childhood visits with her father. The magistrate's office. Stone facade. Official seal above the door. She half fell from the saddle. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground. She grabbed the horse's bridle to steady herself and then staggered toward the door. It opened before she could knock. A middle-aged man with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles stared at her like she'd materialized from a fever dream. His eyes took in her soaked dress, her bare hands red with cold, the wild desperation she knew must be written across her face. Lady Vale? Magistrate Henwick's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man trained to see disaster and maintain composure. What in God's name? Lord Blackwood is at Blackthorn Manor with armed men and forged documents claiming ownership of my estate. Serafina pulled the paper from her bodice and thrust it at him. Duke Ashcombe sent me. He said this would prove Blackwood's fraud. Henwick took the document, unfolded it carefully. His expression shifted as he read. When did Blackwood arrive? Less than an hour ago. His men are attacking the Duke. You need to... I need to see proof before I can act on accusations against a peer of the realm. Henwick's eyes remained on the paper. This appears to be a copy of the original deed transfer from your father to the Duke, dated 2 years ago. If Blackwood claims he purchased the estate 3 months before this, then he's lying. Serafina heard her voice shake. My father would never have sold to Blackwood. They despised each other. Personal feelings don't invalidate legal documents. The magistrate looked up at her. I need to verify the dates on Blackwood's claim before I can determine. There's no time for verification. Serafina took a step forward. The Duke is fighting 6 armed men right now. If you wait to verify anything, there won't be anyone left alive to prosecute. Something shifted behind Henwick's eyes. He folded the document and handed it back to her. Stay here. I'll gather my men. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. You're frozen half to death and... I said, I'm coming with you. Serafina met his stare. That's my home, my inheritance. And the man bleeding to protect it sacrificed 8 years of his life to make sure I'd have something to come back to. So unless you plan to restrain me forcibly, magistrate, I'm riding back with you. Henwick studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. 5 minutes. I need to wake my constables. He disappeared into the building. Serafina stood in the doorway, shaking from cold and adrenaline and rage that had nowhere productive to go. Around her, Ravenswood continued its peaceful evening like violence wasn't erupting 3 miles away. She thought about Adrian sitting at her mother's piano, playing a single note and then leaving like even that small connection to the past was too much to sustain. She thought about him slamming Blackwood against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. She thought about all the years he'd spent watching from a distance while she grew to hate him for an abandonment he'd never chosen. Henwick emerged with 4 constables, all armed, all looking grim in a way that suggested they understood exactly what kind of situation they were riding into. The horses were ready in minutes. Serafina pulled herself into a saddle that wasn't her own and followed the magistrate back into the storm. The ride to Blackthorn Manor felt longer than the ride away from it. Every minute stretched. Every shadow between the trees looked like an ambush waiting to happen. Serafina kept expecting to hear gunshots echoing through the forest, kept imagining arriving to find Adrian's body cooling in the entrance hall while Blackwood stood over him with documents that said murder was just property defense. The manor materialized through the snow like a gravestone. Too quiet. No sounds of fighting. No lights visible through most of the windows. Just the dark bulk of the building against the slightly less dark sky. Henwick raised his hand. The group stopped 50 yards from the entrance. Something's wrong. One of the constables had his pistol drawn. Should be more activity, or everyone's dead. Another constable's voice carried across the snow. Serafina kicked her horse forward before Henwick could stop her. She was across the courtyard and through the entrance doors before the magistrate's shouted protest finished echoing. The entrance hall was a disaster. Broken furniture everywhere. Blood on the marble floor. Scorch marks on the walls where someone had fired a pistol at close range. But no bodies. No Blackwood. No Adrian. No evidence that anyone still occupied the building at all. Serafina dismounted and walked into the destruction like she was touring a museum of her own life falling apart. Her boots crunched on broken glass. Somewhere deeper in the manor she heard water dripping, a shutter banging against a window frame. Nothing else. Henwick and his men entered behind her, searched the building. The magistrate's voice echoed off walls that absorbed sound like they'd been practicing. Anyone you find, detain for questioning. Use force if necessary. The constables dispersed. Serafina stood in the center of the hall and tried to think past the panic rising in her throat. If Adrian had won, he'd be here. Visible. Managing the aftermath. Making sure justice happened to people who'd invaded his home. If Blackwood had won, there'd be bodies. Evidence of victory. Men celebrating their successful theft. Instead, there was just absence, like everyone had vanished mid-fight. Lady Vale. Henwick appeared at her elbow. You should wait outside while we... The West Wing. Serafina turned toward the corridor before she'd fully decided to move. Adrian told me to stay out of the West Wing. Said it wasn't safe. She was walking before Henwick could respond. Back through passages she'd navigated hours earlier. Past the portraits of dead Ashcombs staring down with expressions that suggested they'd seen this kind of disaster before and found it tedious. The doors to the West Wing stood open. Beyond them lay darkness broken only by moonlight filtering through windows that lined the corridor. Serafina could see her breath in the freezing air, could hear her heartbeat loud enough to drown out everything else. She moved forward. The first room she tried was empty. The second revealed nothing but furniture covered in dust sheets. The third, Serafina stopped. Voices, muffled, coming from somewhere deeper in the wing. She followed the sound. Down the corridor. Past more locked doors. Past the portrait of Eleanor Ashcombe, who died at 21. Past everything that had seemed mysterious hours ago and now just felt like context for a tragedy playing out in real time. The voices grew louder, clearer. One of them was Adrian. Serafina ran toward the sound, found a door at the end of the corridor standing ajar. Light spilled through the gap. She pushed it open. The room beyond looked like a study. Books everywhere, papers scattered across a desk, and in the center of it all, bleeding from a dozen wounds but still standing, was Adrian. Blackwood sat in a chair across from him, also bleeding, also looking like he'd been through a war. 4 of his men lay unconscious on the floor. The other 2 flanked the door behind Adrian, pistols drawn, but not aimed at anything specific. Everyone looked at Serafina when she entered. Adrian's expression went through several emotions too quickly to track before settling on fury. "I told you to ride to Ravenswood." "I did." Serafina heard how steady her voice sounded despite everything. "The magistrate is searching the manor. He has 4 armed constables and a very strong interest in seeing Blackwood's documents." Blackwood laughed. Sharp. Bitter. "Doesn't matter. By the time anyone verifies anything, I'll have disappeared and the deed transfer will be filed with the courts. Even if it's eventually overturned, the damage will be done. Your reputation destroyed. The estate buried in legal disputes for years." Adrian took a step toward him. Blackwood's men raised their pistols. "Don't." Blackwood's voice carried warning. "My men have orders to shoot if you come any closer. And unlike you, Ashcombe, I don't particularly care if Lady Vale gets caught in the crossfire." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Serafina watched Adrian's hands curl into fists, watched him calculate odds that didn't favor anyone in the room, watched him realize that the thing he'd spent 8 years protecting was about to be destroyed anyway, because some men didn't need valid claims to ruin lives. They just needed audacity and violence and the willingness to burn everything down if they couldn't have it themselves. She pulled the document from her bodice. "This is the original deed transfer." Serafina held it up so everyone could see. "Signed by my father 2 years ago. Witnessed by Duke Ashcombe's solicitor and notarized by the Crown's official registry. If your claim predates this by 3 months, Lord Blackwood, you should have no trouble producing documentation of equal authenticity." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I have all the documentation required." "Then show it to the magistrate." Serafina took 3 steps into the room. "Let him verify the dates and signatures. If your claim is legitimate, you have nothing to fear from official review." The nobleman's expression shifted. Something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "You think I'm afraid of some provincial magistrate?" He stood slowly. "I have friends in Parliament, connections at court. I could bury you and Ashcombe both in legal proceedings that would take decades to resolve. The question isn't whether I can prove my claim. The question is whether you can survive long enough to challenge it." Adrian moved before Serafina saw him start. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and his fist connected with Blackwood's jaw, hard enough to snap the man's head back. Blackwood's men fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Serafina hit the floor on instinct, heard Adrian grunt like he'd been struck, saw him stumble but not fall. Then Henwick and his constables burst through the door with weapons drawn. "Drop your pistols." "Now!" The magistrate's voice cut through the chaos. "You're all under arrest for assault, illegal armed entry, and attempted murder of a peer of the realm." Blackwood's men looked at each other, looked at their employer bleeding from a broken nose, looked at the 4 armed constables blocking the only exit. They dropped their weapons. Adrian sagged against the desk. Blood spread across his left side where one of the pistol shots had found its mark. His face had gone gray, but his eyes remained focused on Serafina with an intensity that made her chest hurt. "You're shot." She was across the room before she decided to move, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "You absolute idiot, you're—" "I'm fine." Adrian's voice came out strained. "Just a graze. You're bleeding through my hands. I've had worse." "When?" When I watched you ride away thinking I'd never see you again. The admission landed between them like something fragile. Serafina stared at him. At this man who'd taken a bullet protecting an inheritance that should have meant nothing compared to his own survival. Who'd spent 8 years building a fortress out of money and power just so she'd have somewhere safe to return to. She pressed harder against the wound. Her hands were already soaked red. Lord Blackwood. Henwick hauled the nobleman to his feet. You're charged with fraud, assault, and conspiracy to commit theft. Your documents will be examined by Crown officials, and if they're found to be forgeries, as I suspect they are, you'll face additional charges of falsifying legal instruments. Blackwood spat blood onto the floor. You have no idea what you're interfering with, magistrate. When my solicitors hear about this, your solicitors can visit you in prison. Henwick gestured to his constables. Take him and his men to the holding cells. I'll send word to London in the morning. The constables hauled Blackwood and his men out of the room. Their protests faded as they were dragged down the corridor. Serafina became aware that she was still kneeling on the floor with her hands pressed against Adrian's side, that he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room worth his attention, that her heart was beating fast enough to make her dizzy. You should have stayed in Ravenswood. Adrian's voice had dropped to something quieter, softer, safer. I don't do what I'm told. I noticed. You could have died, but I didn't. You could have. Serafina heard her voice crack. I rode away and spent every second imagining arriving to find you dead because I wasn't here to… To what? Adrian's hand came up to cover hers. His fingers were cold. To fight 6 armed men? To get yourself killed trying to protect someone who spent 8 years making sure you'd never have to protect anyone? She didn't have an answer for that. Henwick cleared his throat from the doorway. Your Grace needs medical attention. I've sent for the doctor, but it will be at least an hour before he arrives from Ravenswood. In the meantime, I can manage until then. Adrian started to stand. His legs nearly gave out. Serafina caught him before he could fall. You can't even walk. She wedged herself under his arm to support his weight. Where's your room? 2nd floor, east wing. Can you make it that far? I'll make it. He didn't make it. They got as far as the main staircase before Adrian's legs finally gave out completely. He sagged against Serafina hard enough to nearly take them both down. She managed to ease him into a sitting position on the stairs, her hands still pressed against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Henwick materialized with 2 footmen. Between the 3 of them, they got Adrian up the stairs and into a bedroom that looked like it had never been used for anything except existing. Sparse furniture, dark walls, no personal touches anywhere. They laid him on the bed. Serafina pulled off his coat and waistcoat to get better access to the wound. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the left side. Exit wound in his back suggested it had gone straight through. Painful, but probably not fatal if they could stop the bleeding. Probably. She tore strips from the bed linens and pressed them against both wounds. Adrian's hand came up to cover hers again. You don't have to stay. Yes, I do. Serafina. His eyes were starting to lose focus. The blood loss was catching up with him. You should rest. Let the servants handle this. The servants aren't the ones who owe you 8 years of apologies. She pressed harder against the wound. So unless you're planning to die in the next hour just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation, Your Grace, you're stuck with me. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Bossy. You have no idea. Henwick appeared in the doorway. The doctor should arrive within the hour. I've posted constables throughout the manor in case Blackwood had additional men we haven't found. You're safe here. Thank you, Magistrate. Serafina didn't look away from Adrian. For everything. Just doing my duty, Lady Vale. Henwick paused. For what it's worth, your father was a complicated man, but I don't believe he would have wanted this for you. He left before she could respond. Serafina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands maintaining pressure on wounds that were finally starting to slow their bleeding. Adrian's breathing had steadied into something more regular. His eyes tracked her face like he was trying to memorize it. You're staring, she kept her voice light. I spent 8 years not being allowed to look at you. Adrian's words came out slurred with exhaustion and blood loss. I'm making up for lost time. You're delirious. Probably. The bullet went through. You'll survive. Good to know. But you're an idiot for fighting them alone. Would you have preferred I let Blackwood take you? I would have preferred you trust that I could handle myself. Serafina adjusted the makeshift bandages. I'm not 17 anymore, Adrian. I don't need you sacrificing yourself to protect me from uncomfortable truths. His hand tightened over hers. Old habits. Then develop new ones. The silence stretched between them. Outside the window, snow had stopped falling, the storm breaking as suddenly as it had arrived. Adrian's eyes drifted closed. For a moment, Serafina thought he'd lost consciousness. Then he spoke again, so quietly she almost missed it. I'm sorry. For what? For letting you think I didn't care. For disappearing without explaining. For choosing your safety over your autonomy and never giving you the chance to decide what risks were worth taking. The apology landed in the space between them like something too heavy to hold. My father threatened your brother. Serafina kept her hands pressed against his wounds. You did what you had to do. I did what I thought I had to do. Adrian's eyes opened again. There's a difference. If I could go back knowing what I know now, what would you do differently? I'd tell your father to do his worst. I'd trust that together we could find a solution that didn't require me disappearing for 8 years. I'd choose you over safety every single time. Serafina felt something crack open in her chest. Even if it meant your brother hanged? Even then. Adrian's voice had dropped to barely a whisper, because spending 8 years without you was its own kind of death. Slower, lonelier. And I chose it thinking I was protecting you from having to make impossible choices. But all I did was make them for you and leave you thinking you weren't worth fighting for. You're still an idiot. Yes, but you're my idiot. The words hung between them for a heartbeat. Then Adrian smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she'd returned, and Serafina felt the last 8 years start to crack apart. Does that mean you forgive me? Ask me again when you're not bleeding all over your own bed. That's not a no. It's not a yes either. I'll take it. The doctor arrived 40 minutes later. An older man with steady hands and the kind of calm that suggested he'd seen enough gunshot wounds to find them tedious rather than exciting. He examined Adrian's injuries, cleaned and stitched both wounds, and declared that the Duke would survive but needed rest and observation for the next several days. No strenuous activity. The doctor fixed Serafina with a look that suggested he knew exactly how likely that instruction was to be followed. Keep the wounds clean, change the bandages twice daily, send for me immediately if fever develops or bleeding resumes. He left her with supplies and instructions and the kind of silence that felt heavy with implications. Serafina sat in a chair beside Adrian's bed and watched him sleep. The exhaustion she'd been holding at bay for hours finally crashed over her. Her hands were still stained with his blood. Her dress was ruined. Her entire body ached from cold and adrenaline and the aftermath of violence. But Adrian was alive, breathing steadily. His face relaxed in sleep in a way it never was when conscious. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, pale dawn light was filtering through the windows and someone was knocking on the door. Margaret entered carrying a tray with tea and food that smelled like heaven. My lady. The maid's eyes took in Serafina's blood-stained hands and ruined dress. You should rest. I can watch His Grace while you... I'm fine. Serafina accepted the tea gratefully. What's the situation downstairs? The magistrate departed an hour ago with Lord Blackwood and his men. The constables found additional evidence of fraud in Blackwood's belongings, letters discussing falsified documents, communications with a forger in London. It appears this wasn't his first attempt at stealing estates through legal manipulation. So the charges will stick? The magistrate seemed confident. Margaret set the tray on a side table. The servants have cleaned the entrance hall and repaired what could be quickly fixed. Mr. Thorne asks whether you require anything else for His Grace's recovery. Just time. Serafina looked at Adrian's sleeping form, and probably less excitement for the immediate future. Margaret smiled. I'll inform Mr. Thorne. She paused at the door. If I may say so, my lady, it's good to have you home. She left before Serafina could respond. Home. The word felt foreign and familiar simultaneously. This place had been home once, before her father's threats and Adrian's disappearance and 8 years of believing she'd never belong anywhere again. Now she sat in a dead man's bedroom, because this had been Adrian's father's room once, she remembered, watching the morning light paint shadows across walls that had witnessed generations of Ashcombs making terrible decisions in the name of family duty. Adrian woke around midday, His eyes found her immediately. You stayed. Where else would I go? Serafina poured water from the pitcher Margaret had left. Drink this. Doctor's orders. He managed to sit up enough to drink without spilling. His face was still too pale, but the steady breathing suggested no infection had set in overnight. How bad is it? You'll survive. Won't be dancing anytime soon, but the bullet went clean through. Doctor says you were lucky. Lucky. Adrian set down the empty cup. Yes, that's exactly what I feel. You're alive. That's more than Blackwood's men can say if his testimony leads to prosecution for previous crimes. Small mercies. He looked at her for a long moment. You should eat. You've been taking care of me all night. I ate. Liar. Fine. I'll eat if you rest. Deal. They spent the day in careful domesticity. Serafina changed his bandages when the doctor's schedule demanded, brought him food that he picked at without enthusiasm, read to him from books she found in the Manor's library because sitting in silence felt too heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Evening arrived too quickly. Margaret built up the fire before retreating. Serafina found herself alone with Adrian again, the space between them feeling both smaller and more impossible than it had hours earlier. You don't have to stay. Adrian's voice broke the silence. I'm recovering. You've done more than enough. What if I want to stay? The question hung between them like a challenge. Adrian's eyes met hers. Why would you want that? Because 8 years ago you disappeared and I spent every day after wondering what I'd done wrong. Serafina set down the book she'd been pretending to read. And then I came back and discovered you'd preserved my rooms and paid my father's debts and maintained a music room like keeping the past alive could somehow fix what we'd lost. And I'm angry about all of it, but I'm also what? Also tired of pretending I don't still care what happens to you. The admission cracked something open between them. Adrian pushed himself more upright despite the obvious pain it caused. I meant what I said before. About choosing you over safety. About regretting every decision that kept us apart. And I meant what I said about you being an idiot. Serafina moved to sit on the edge of his bed. But I'm starting to think maybe we were both idiots. You for leaving without explaining. Me for believing you didn't care enough to stay. We can't undo 8 years. No. But we can decide what happens next. And what do you want to happen next? Serafina looked at him. At this man who'd taken a bullet protecting her inheritance. Who'd spent 8 years building something stable enough to survive her return. Who'd loved her badly but persistently, and maybe that was worth something. I want the truth. All of it. Everything my father threatened. Everything you sacrificed. Everything you've been hiding in the West Wing that you think will make me see you differently. Adrian's expression shuddered. You don't want that. Yes, I do. Because I'm done with half-truths and noble sacrifices and people making decisions about my life without asking what I actually want. The silence stretched between them. Then Adrian nodded once. Tomorrow, when I can stand without bleeding through fresh bandages, I'll show you everything in the West Wing, all the family history I've spent my adult life trying to understand, and then you can decide whether what we had 8 years ago is worth rebuilding or if some things are better left as ruins. Serafina stood, smoothed her ruined dress, met his eyes with something that felt like resolution. Tomorrow, then. But fair warning, Your Grace, I'm done being protected from uncomfortable truths. Whatever's in that wing, whatever your family's hiding, I'm strong enough to handle it. I know you are. Adrian's voice carried something that might have been pride. I'm just not sure I'm strong enough to watch you learn things about me that might make you leave again. Then I guess we'll find out together. She left him alone with his wounds and his fears and the kind of silence that comes before revelations that change everything. In the corridor outside, Serafina pressed her back against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. Tomorrow she'd learn whatever secrets the West Wing held. Tomorrow she'd discover what Adrian had been protecting her from for 8 years. Tomorrow everything would change again, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she found in that darkness would force her to choose between the life she'd built in his absence and the love she'd never quite managed to bury. The morning came cold and brutal. Serafina woke in a chair beside Adrian's bed with her neck aching and sunlight cutting through the windows like accusations. She'd fallen asleep sometime after midnight watching him breathe, making sure infection hadn't set in while he was too stubborn to admit weakness. Adrian was already awake, His eyes tracked her movements as she stood and stretched muscles that protested the night spent in furniture not designed for sleeping.
You stayed again. His voice carried something between gratitude and concern. Someone had to make sure you didn't die of stubbornness. Serafina moved to check his bandages. The wounds looked clean. No fever, no signs of infection taking hold. How do you feel? Like I was shot yesterday. Progress. She helped him sit up despite his protests. Can you stand? Eventually. That's not what I asked. Adrian swung his legs over the side of the bed with the kind of careful precision that suggested every movement hurt more than he'd admit. He stood, swayed, caught himself on the bedpost before she could reach him. I'm fine. You're barely upright. Close enough. He took 3 steps toward the wardrobe. His legs held. Mostly. I promised you answers. The West Wing doesn't get any less revealing just because I'm injured. Serafina watched him pull clothes from the wardrobe with hands that shook just enough to notice. You should rest another day. Whatever secrets your family's been hiding have waited this long. They can wait longer. No, they can't. Adrian turned to face her. Because the longer I wait, the more time I have to convince myself that some truths are better left buried. And I'm done making decisions about what you can handle without asking what you actually want. The words hung between them like a promise neither was sure they could keep. Serafina left him to dress and returned to her own rooms to change into something that wasn't stained with his blood. Margaret appeared with fresh clothes and breakfast that Serafina barely tasted. The maid's expression suggested she knew something significant was about to happen, but had too much training to ask questions. His Grace is waiting in the entrance hall, my lady. Margaret's voice carried careful neutrality. He asked that you meet him when ready. Serafina found Adrian standing at the base of the grand staircase, looking like a man preparing for execution. He dressed in dark clothes that made him look older, more severe. The bandages beneath his shirt were visible as slight bulk around his torso, but he stood straight enough that anyone not looking closely might miss the injury entirely. Ready? His eyes met hers. No. But let's go anyway. They walked through corridors that felt different in daylight, less oppressive, more simply old and full of history that had calcified into tradition. The portraits of dead Ashcombs watched their progress with expressions that suggested disappointment was a family inheritance as reliable as land and titles. The doors to the West Wing stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow them. Adrian stopped at the threshold. His hand gripped the doorframe hard enough that his knuckles went white. Everything I show you stays between us. His voice had dropped to something barely audible. Not because I'm ashamed, but because some family history is dangerous for anyone outside the bloodline to know. You're asking me to keep secrets I haven't learned yet? I'm asking you to understand that the Ashcombe family survived generations by being ruthless when necessary and silent about what that ruthlessness cost. Serafina stepped across the threshold. Then show me what it cost. They moved through the West Wing with Adrian leading, past the portrait of Eleanor Ashcombe, who died at 21. Past the locked doors Serafina had tried the night before. Past everything that had seemed mysterious and now just felt inevitable. Adrian stopped outside a door near the end of the corridor. This room hasn't been opened in 5 years. Not since my father died and I inherited everything he'd spent his life protecting. He unlocked the door. The hinges protested. Beyond lay a study that looked like it had been abandoned mid-sentence. Papers covered every surface. Books lay open on reading stands. Maps decorated the walls with routes marked in faded ink. And covering one entire wall were portraits, dozens of them. All women, all bearing some resemblance to each other. All with small plaques beneath listing names and dates. Eleanor Ashcombe, 1777 to 1798. Catherine Ashcombe, 1802 to 1821. Margaret Ashcombe, 1834 to 1851. The list went on. 23 women in total, all dead before their 25th birthday. Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach. What is this? Family history. Adrian's voice had gone flat. The kind we don't discuss at social functions. Every generation of Ashcombes for the last 200 years has produced at least one woman who dies young. Usually the eldest daughter. Usually between 18 and 25. Usually after displaying signs of what doctors call melancholia, but my family calls something else. What else? The Ashcombe curse. He gestured at the portraits like they were evidence in a trial. My father spent 40 years researching it.
trying to understand why women in our family develop symptoms that look like madness but follow patterns too specific to be coincidence. Depression that arrives suddenly, paranoia that has no external cause, violent outbursts followed by periods of complete withdrawal, and then death, sometimes by their own hand, sometimes from fevers no doctor can treat. Sometimes they just stop breathing for no reason medicine can explain. Serafina stared at the wall of dead women. This is what you've been hiding? Part of it. Adrian moved to the desk and pulled out a leather-bound journal. This was my father's research. Decades of tracking symptoms and outcomes, interviewing surviving family members, searching for patterns that might explain why we lose daughters with such brutal regularity. He opened the journal to a page marked with black ribbon, and he found one. The page showed a family tree going back 8 generations. Each generation had names circled in red ink, all women, all dead young. And beside each name was a notation describing their final days. Violent episodes. Destroyed her rooms before taking poison. Convinced servants were trying to kill her. Locked herself in the tower and starved. Attacked her mother with a letter opener. Died 3 days later of fever that had no physical cause. The pattern was undeniable. Serafina felt her hands start to shake. Why are you showing me this? Because I need you to understand what your father knew. Adrian closed the journal with deliberate care. What he used as leverage to make me disappear. My father knew about this curse? He discovered it. Adrian's jaw tightened. 3 months before I was supposed to propose to you formally, he came to my father with questions about Ashcombe family history, about why so many women in our line died young. And my father, thinking your father was just being thorough about his daughter's future prospects, told him everything. Serafina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He used this to threaten you? He told me that if I didn't leave and never contact you again, he'd make sure everyone in society knew that the Ashcombe bloodline carried hereditary madness, that any woman who married into our family was signing a death warrant for her daughters, that my own mother had shown early symptoms before she died, that I was condemning you to either madness or childlessness by pursuing marriage. The words landed like physical blows. But that's not... Serafina heard how her voice shook. There's no proof this is hereditary. Medical science in 1815 didn't understand cholera either, but people still died of it. Adrian's eyes were bleak. Your father didn't need proof. He just needed enough doubt to destroy my family's reputation and make any marriage between us impossible. So he added a second threat. If I didn't leave quietly, he'd fabricate evidence that my brother was involved in sedition and have him tried for treason. 2 threats. 1 impossible choice. Serafina walked along the wall of portraits, all these women staring out from their frames with expressions that suggested they'd known something was wrong long before symptoms appeared, all dead before they could live enough life to make the dying meaningful. Did you believe him? She kept her back to Adrian. About the curse? I believe the pattern was real. Whether it's hereditary or environmental or just tragic coincidence repeated often enough to look intentional, I don't know. But I believe that your father would use it to destroy everything I cared about if I didn't do exactly what he demanded. So you left. So I left. And I spent 8 years building enough power and money to ensure that if you ever came back, you'd be protected from anyone trying to use family history as a weapon against you. Serafina turned to face him. You could have told me. We could have faced this together. You were 17. Adrian's voice cracked. You believed in fairy tales and happy endings and the idea that love could overcome any obstacle. I couldn't tell you that marrying me might mean watching our daughters go mad before they turn 25. That was too much weight for anyone to carry at 17. And at 25? Her voice came out harder than intended. You think I can't handle difficult truths now? I think you deserve the choice I never gave you. Adrian gestured at the portraits, at the journal, at everything his father had spent decades documenting. This is the truth about my family, about what marrying me might mean for any children we had. And I'm not asking you to accept it or forgive me for hiding it. I'm just showing you why I made the choices I did. The silence stretched between them like something breakable. Serafina looked at the portraits again. 23 dead women. Generations of tragedy documented with clinical precision. And underneath it all, the question neither of them wanted to voice. Was Adrian right to leave? Was protecting her from this truth worth 8 years of separation? She didn't have an answer. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke the moment. Mr. Thorne appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested disaster. Your Grace. A visitor has arrived demanding immediate audience. Lord Edmund Ashcombe. Adrian's face went white. My uncle is here? Yes, Your Grace. He arrived 20 minutes ago with his solicitor and several documents he claims require your immediate attention. He's waiting in the drawing room and has made it clear he won't leave until you speak with him. Serafina watched Adrian's expression shift through several emotions too quickly to track. This is the uncle who raised you after your parents died? Yes. Adrian's voice had gone flat. And if he's here with his solicitor, it means he's found a way to challenge my inheritance of the dukedom. Can he do that? If he has proof I'm mentally unfit, or if he can demonstrate the title should have passed to him instead of my father, yes. Adrian turned toward the door. Excuse me, Lady Serafina. This conversation will have to continue later. I'm coming with you. That's not... I said I'm coming with you. Serafina moved to block his exit. You've spent 8 years making decisions alone. Whatever happens next, you don't face it without someone watching your back. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Gratitude mixed with resignation. Fine, but stay quiet and let me handle Lord Edmund. He's dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with violence. They descended to the drawing room together. Serafina could feel Adrian's tension radiating off him in waves. Whatever relationship he had with his uncle, it clearly wasn't warm. Lord Edmund Ashcombe stood by the fireplace like he owned it, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that suggested he'd spent his entire life believing himself superior to everyone he met. A thin man in solicitor's robes stood beside him holding a leather document case. Adrian! Lord Edmund's voice carried across the room like a judgment. How good of you to finally make time for family. Uncle? Adrian's tone suggested the relationship was anything but familial. Your arrival is unexpected. I wasn't aware you'd left London. I wouldn't need to travel if you responded to correspondence. Lord Edmund's eyes flicked to Serafina. But I see you've been occupied with other matters. Lady Vale, I presume. Your father's unfortunate passing has my deepest condolences. The false sympathy made Serafina's skin crawl. Thank you, Lord Edmund. The older man turned his attention back to Adrian. We need to discuss matters of inheritance. Privately. Anything you need to say can be said in front of Lady Serafina. Adrian remained by the door like he was considering bolting. She's aware of family circumstances. Is she aware that you've been declared mentally incompetent by 3 separate physicians? Lord Edmund pulled a document from his solicitor's case. Or that as your legal guardian during your minority, I've been granted authority to petition for removal of your title if you demonstrate continued instability? The room went silent. Adrian's expression didn't change, but Serafina saw his hands curl into fists. Those evaluations were conducted 5 years ago when I was recovering from my father's death. They have no current legal standing. They do if you've demonstrated continued symptoms. Lord Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. And according to reports I've received from certain servants, you've been exhibiting concerning behavior. Maintaining rooms for a woman who hasn't lived here in 8 years. Spending evenings alone in the music room talking to yourself. Paying off debts for a family that could offer you nothing in return. These actions suggest an inability to manage your affairs rationally. Those actions suggest loyalty and honor. Adrian's voice had gone dangerously quiet, neither of which you'd recognize if they introduced themselves. And there's the temper. Lord Edmund gestured as if presenting evidence. The violent outbursts, the inability to control emotional responses. All symptoms documented in my petition to have your title transferred to the next eligible heir, which would be you. Serafina heard her own voice cut through the tension. How convenient that your nephew's mental instability benefits you so directly. Lord Edmund's eyes locked onto her. You know nothing about this family or what's required to preserve its legacy. Adrian's father indulged him, allowed him to develop attachments that compromised his judgment. I'm simply ensuring the dukedom passes to someone capable of rational leadership, by having me declared insane. Adrian took 3 steps into the room. Based on the testimony of servants you've bribed and physicians you've paid to provide favorable evaluations, that's not concern for family legacy, uncle. That's theft dressed up as medical necessity. The solicitor cleared his throat. Your Grace, I should inform you that Lord Edmund has secured approval from the Crown's Medical Review Board to conduct a formal evaluation of your mental fitness. If that evaluation determines you're unable to manage your affairs, the title will be temporarily suspended pending. This is absurd. Serafina moved to stand beside Adrian. He's not mentally incompetent. He's been managing one of the largest estates in England for 5 years without issue. Has he? Lord Edmund's expression suggested he'd been waiting for this opening. Or has he been making increasingly erratic decisions that jeopardize the family's standing? Forgiving massive debts without compensation, maintaining expensive properties for no productive purpose, engaging in violent confrontations with peers of the realm. These are not the actions of a stable mind. These are the actions of someone trying to protect people he cares about. Adrian's voice had dropped to something barely controlled. But you wouldn't understand that because you've never cared about anyone except yourself and whatever power you think you're entitled to. Lord Edmund's mask cracked slightly. I raised you after your parents died. I ensured you received the education and training necessary to inherit the dukedom. And this is how you repay that investment? By squandering resources on sentimentality and refusing to make the hard decisions required of your position? You raised me because it gave you access to family wealth. Adrian's hands were shaking now. You used my inheritance to fund your gambling debts and your mistresses and your political ambitions. Don't pretend this is about concern for my well-being when we both know it's about you wanting control of assets you've already spent years embezzling. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Lord Edmund's expression went cold. Careful, Adrian. Accusing me of financial impropriety without evidence is slander. And given your current position, making enemies of family members with the authority to have you evaluated seems remarkably foolish. I have evidence. Adrian pulled a folded paper from his coat. 5 years of discrepancies in estate accounting that my solicitors have been documenting since I took control. Payments to your accounts that have no corresponding justification. Transfers of assets that were never properly documented. Enough to have you tried for theft if I chose to pursue it. You're bluffing. Am I? Adrian's eyes burned with something dangerous. Test me and find out. The silence stretched thin enough to snap. Lord Edmund's solicitor whispered something urgent in his employer's ear. The older man's jaw tightened. He looked at Adrian like he was reconsidering his entire approach. Perhaps we can discuss this more productively. Lord Edmund's tone had shifted to something resembling negotiation. I'm willing to withdraw my petition if you agree to certain conditions. What conditions? First, you submit to a private evaluation by a physician of my choosing, not to declare you incompetent, just to establish baseline mental health for future reference. Second, you agree to allow me oversight of any major financial decisions until the Crown is satisfied you're managing the estate responsibly. Third, he looked at Serafina. You end whatever relationship you're developing with Lady Vale. Her family's debts and her presence here represent exactly the kind of sentimental attachment that compromises your judgment. Send her away and prove you can prioritize duty over emotion. The demand landed like a physical blow. Adrian didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with his uncle's ultimatum hanging between them like a noose. Serafina felt rage building in her chest. You want him to choose between his title and his personal life? That's extortion. That's reality. Lord Edmund's voice carried the weight of centuries of aristocratic entitlement. The dukedom requires sacrifices. Personal happiness is secondary to maintaining family legacy. If Adrian isn't willing to make those sacrifices, he's not fit to hold the title. Adrian's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. Get out. Lord Edmund raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon? I said, get out of my home. Adrian took a step forward. You can file whatever petitions you want, conduct whatever evaluations the Crown approves, but you will not stand in my drawing room and tell me who I'm allowed to care about, not after what you've already taken from this family. What I've taken? Lord Edmund's composure cracked completely. I held this family together after your father's death. I ensured you inherited anything at all instead of watching the estate be divided among cousins and distant relatives. And this is how you repay that loyalty? You didn't hold anything together. Adrian's voice rose. You waited like a vulture for my father to die and then spent 5 years trying to strip everything valuable before I was old enough to stop you. Don't lecture me about loyalty when the only person you've ever been loyal to is yourself. Lord Edmund's face had gone red. You ungrateful, leave, now, or I'll have the constables remove you for trespassing. You're making a mistake, Adrian. The older man's voice had dropped to something dangerous. Reject my offer, and I'll make sure the Crown's evaluation is thorough enough to find every instability you've tried to hide. Every visit to that music room, every night you spend talking to ghosts, every decision that proves you're too damaged by family history to be trusted with power. Then do it. Adrian moved to the door and opened it, but stop pretending this is about concern for my well-being when we both know it's about you wanting access to wealth you've already stolen from. Lord Edmund looked at his nephew for a long moment, then at Serafina. His expression suggested he was filing her away as future leverage. This isn't over, he gestured to his solicitor. The Crown's evaluation will proceed, and when it's complete, we'll see who the law considers fit to hold a dukedom. He swept out of the room with his solicitor trailing behind. The sound of their departure echoed through the manor like a threat. Adrian closed the door, leaned against it. His hands were shaking badly enough now that he couldn't hide it. Serafina crossed the room and took his hands in hers. That was a disaster. Adrian's voice cracked. He's going to push for that evaluation, and he's going to make sure every questionable decision I've made in the last 8 years gets documented as evidence of instability. The rooms I maintained for you, the music room visits, the debt forgiveness, everything I did to protect you will be used to prove I'm too mentally compromised to hold my title. Then we fight it. We find physicians who will testify you're stable. We document the embezzlement. You heard what he demanded. Adrian pulled his hands free. He wants me to send you away, to prove I can prioritize duty over personal attachment. And if the Crown's evaluation determines I'm mentally unfit, they might agree with him. So we prove them wrong. How? By demonstrating that I'm willing to sacrifice someone I care about to maintain power? That's exactly the kind of ruthless calculation they want to see. And if I refuse, it proves I'm too sentimental for leadership. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Choose Serafina and lose everything. Choose the dukedom and prove he was exactly as damaged as his uncle claimed. Serafina felt something crack inside her chest. This is what you've been carrying alone for 5 years. The threat that any attachment could be used as evidence against you. Adrian nodded. Why do you think I never pursued anyone after I sent you away? Why I spent 8 years isolated in this manner, making decisions that looked increasingly eccentric to outsiders? I knew that showing weakness or emotion or caring about anything except duty would be used against me eventually. I just didn't expect my own uncle to be the one wielding the knife. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Serafina looked at Adrian and saw decades of loneliness stretching ahead if he chose survival over connection, and saw her own future reflected back, safe but alone, protected from scandal, but isolated from everyone who might care whether she lived or disappeared entirely. We need a strategy. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Your uncle expects you to react emotionally, to either send me away and prove his point, or keep me here and confirm his accusations. So we do neither. What's the alternative? We prove that every decision you made was rational and justified. The rooms you maintained weren't sentiment. They were preservation of valuable assets. The debts you forgave were investments in family alliances. The music room visits were estate management, checking on properties that required oversight. We reframe everything he's using against you as evidence of careful stewardship instead of emotional instability. And us? Adrian's eyes searched hers. How do we reframe what's developing between us? We don't. Serafina felt the decision crystallize even as she spoke it. We acknowledge it openly as a strategic alliance between families. Your uncle wants to paint you as someone compromised by emotion, so we prove that your decisions are always calculated, including this one. You're suggesting we pretend whatever we feel for each other is just political strategy. I'm suggesting we survive first and sort out what's real later. The words hung between them like a promise neither was sure they could keep. Adrian studied her face for a long moment. You understand what you're offering? If we present this as strategic alliance instead of genuine feeling, we're giving up any chance of people believing there's something real between us. Better that than watching you lose everything your family built, because your uncle can't accept that loyalty exists outside calculations of personal benefit. The silence stretched thin,
Then Adrian nodded once. We'll need documentation. Evidence that every questionable decision I made had rational justification. We'll need testimony from servants that my behavior has been consistent and controlled. And we'll need your father's records proving he was the one who initiated the separation 8 years ago. I don't have those records.
But your father's solicitor might. Adrian's expression had shifted into something harder, more calculating. If we can prove he threatened me with false accusations to force me away, it establishes a pattern of others trying to manipulate me using emotional leverage. Makes my uncle's current attempt look like more of the same. Serafina felt the pieces clicking together. And if we can document your uncle's embezzlement, it gives him motive to want you declared incompetent before you can pursue legal action against him. Exactly. Adrian pulled away from the door. He moved like a man who'd just remembered how to be dangerous. We have 3 weeks before the Crown's evaluation. That's enough time to build a case that makes my uncle look like the unstable one. What do you need from me? Everything. Testimony about your father's threats, documentation of the debt forgiveness as legitimate estate management, and most importantly, his eyes locked with hers. Public appearances that demonstrate we're forming a strategic alliance instead of repeating past emotional attachments. Can you do that? Serafina thought about 8 years spent believing she wasn't worth fighting for, about the man who'd taken a bullet protecting her inheritance, about the choice between safety and truth that neither of them should have to make. Yes, she heard how steady her voice sounded. I can do that. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Serafina sent word to her father's solicitor requesting all correspondence related to the Vale Ashcombe families from 8 years prior. Adrian compiled documentation of every major financial decision he'd made since inheriting, with justifications that reframed sentiment as strategy. By evening, they had the outline of a defense that might work if they could execute it perfectly. And if they could ignore the fact that pretending their relationship was purely strategic meant lying about the only honest thing either of them had left. Dinner was a tense affair. Mr. Thorne served them in the formal dining hall with the kind of professional discretion that suggested he understood something significant had shifted. Adrian sat at the head of the table looking exhausted. The gunshot wound was clearly bothering him more than he'd admit. You should rest. Serafina pushed food around her plate without eating. You were shot less than 48 hours ago, and you've spent today fighting with your uncle and planning legal strategy. I'll rest when we've secured the defense. Adrian's voice carried the kind of determination that suggested rest wasn't currently possible. If my uncle moves forward with his petition before we're ready, then we'll deal with it. But killing yourself won't help anyone. The words landed harder than she'd intended. Adrian set down his fork and met her eyes. I'm sorry for dragging you into family politics that should have stayed buried. You came back expecting answers, and instead you're in the middle of a succession crisis. I came back because my father died and left me with nothing except debts. Serafina heard the bitterness in her own voice. You're the one who turned nothing into something. Don't apologize for that. The silence stretched between them. After dinner, they retreated to separate rooms. Serafina spent the evening reviewing documents her father's solicitor had sent over. Letters, contracts, evidence of the threats and manipulations that had destroyed her relationship with Adrian 8 years earlier. And buried in the middle of it all, a letter in her father's handwriting dated 3 months before Adrian disappeared. Serafina unfolded it carefully. The contents made her stomach turn. Her father hadn't just threatened Adrian, he documented his entire strategy for forcing the separation. The false accusations he planned to level against Adrian's brother, the way he'd use the Ashcombe family curse as social leverage, the timeline for ensuring Adrian left before the engagement became official. And at the bottom, in her father's precise script, I do this to protect my daughter from a fate worse than mere heartbreak. Better she believe herself abandoned than watch her future children succumb to madness that has claimed generations of Ashcombe women. Serafina read the words 3 times before their full meaning sank in. Her father had known about the curse, had used it to justify destroying her future, had convinced himself that separating her from Adrian was protection instead of control, and had never once asked what she wanted. The rage that swept through her was cold and complete. She stood from the desk and walked to Adrian's room without thinking about the impropriety of visiting a man's bedroom at night. He answered her knock, looking like he hadn't been sleeping either. Read this. She thrust the letter at him.
Adrian took it. His expression shifted as he read. By the final paragraph, his hands were shaking. He wrote it down. The entire manipulation, like he was proud of it. He thought he was saving me. Serafina heard how hollow her voice sounded. From a marriage that would doom my daughters to madness. From a man who couldn't be trusted to prioritize my safety over his own feelings. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing.
That doesn't make it right.
No.
But it explains why he never showed remorse. He died thinking he'd protected me from a terrible fate.
Serafina took the letter back and folded it carefully.
This proves your uncle's claims about emotional instability are following a pattern. First, my father tried to manipulate you using family secrets. Now your uncle is trying the same strategy with medical evaluations. It makes both of them look calculating instead of you looking compromised. Adrian studied her face for a long moment. You're very calm about discovering your father orchestrated 8 years of separation because he thought he was protecting you from hereditary madness. I'm furious, but fury doesn't help us right now. Strategy does. The words came out colder than she'd intended. Adrian's expression softened into something that looked like concern. Serafina, don't. She held up a hand. If we start acknowledging how we actually feel about any of this, we won't be able to do what needs doing. So let's just focus on surviving the next 3 weeks and sort out the emotional wreckage later. She left before he could respond. Back in her room, Serafina sat by the window and watched snow begin falling again, thick flakes that would bury the roads by morning, trapping everyone inside this frozen monument to secrets that refused to stay buried. 3 weeks until the Crown's evaluation. 3 weeks to build a defense strong enough to survive aristocratic entitlement and medical prejudice and centuries of family dysfunction compressed into legal proceedings. 3 weeks to prove that caring about someone didn't make you weak. That love wasn't evidence of instability. That sometimes the most rational decision was choosing connection over isolation even when the cost looked insurmountable. She thought about Adrian sitting at her mother's piano, about all the rooms he'd preserved and debts he'd forgiven and years he'd spent alone rather than risk caring about anyone who could be used against him. And she thought about her father's letter, about protection that looked like control and love that manifested as manipulation and all the ways people destroyed each other while claiming noble intentions. The snow continued falling. Somewhere in the manor, Adrian was probably still awake, still planning, still trying to find a way to survive, without sacrificing the few honest things either of them had left. Serafina pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made herself a promise. Whatever happened in 3 weeks, whatever the Crown decided about Adrian's fitness to hold his title, she wouldn't let him face it alone. Even if proving his stability meant pretending the thing growing between them was just strategy, instead of the first real connection either of them had felt in 8 years. Even if winning meant losing the only honest thing they'd found in all this calculated brutality. Even if survival required becoming exactly the kind of cold, rational aristocrat his uncle claimed he should be. She'd help him do it. Because sometimes love meant protecting someone from losing everything they'd built, even if it meant burying what you actually felt so deep it might never surface again. The snow buried the courtyard. The darkness pressed in from all sides. And Serafina sat alone with a dead man's letter and a living man's impossible choice, and the knowledge that 3 weeks from now, everything would change in ways neither of them could predict or control. 3 weeks felt like 3 hours. Serafina spent every waking moment building Adrian's defense, like she was constructing a fortress from paper and precedent. Her father's letter became Exhibit 1 in a pattern of aristocratic manipulation. Financial records documenting Lord Edmund's embezzlement filled 3 leather portfolios. Testimony from servants who'd witnessed Adrian's careful management of the estate grew into a stack of affidavits thick enough to stop a bullet. Maybe that was the point. Words as armor against accusations that had no basis in reality, but all the weight of institutional prejudice behind them. The Crown's evaluation was scheduled for the first day of March. Gray morning. Snow still falling like the winter had forgotten how to end. Serafina stood in the entrance hall watching Adrian prepare to face 3 royal physicians who'd been given carte blanche to determine whether a duke was fit to keep breathing in his own title. He looked carved from ice. Dark coat, perfectly tied cravat, hair combed back with enough severity to suggest military discipline. Every inch the aristocrat his uncle claimed he couldn't be. But Serafina saw the tremor in his hands when he thought nobody was watching, saw the way his jaw tightened when footsteps approached, saw a man preparing for execution trying to convince everyone it was just another tedious obligation. Remember what we practiced. Her voice stayed low enough that only he could hear. Answer their questions directly. Don't elaborate unless they ask for detail. And if they bring up the music room or the preserved chambers, I tell them it's estate preservation and asset management. Adrian's eyes met hers. We've been over this. I know, but repetition helps, or it just gives anxiety more time to breed. The physicians arrived in a carriage bearing the crown's seal. 3 men who climbed out looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The eldest carried a medical bag that probably contained instruments for measuring skull dimensions and other pseudoscientific methods for determining mental fitness. Serafina felt rage building in her throat. These men would spend 4 hours with Adrian and then decide whether 8 years of careful stewardship meant anything compared to the word of an uncle with embezzlement charges hanging over his head like a noose he was desperate to avoid. Your Grace. The eldest physician bowed with the bare minimum courtesy protocol demanded. I am Dr. Whitmore. These are my colleagues, Dr. Harrison and Dr. Pembroke. We're here to conduct the evaluation ordered by the Crown's Medical Review Board. Of course. Adrian's voice carried no emotion at all. Shall we use the study? That will be acceptable. They disappeared into the east wing. The door closed with a sound like a tomb sealing. Serafina stood in the entrance hall feeling useless. Margaret appeared at her elbow with tea she didn't want and sympathy that couldn't fix anything. His Grace will be fine, my lady. Everyone who serves him knows his mind is sound. Everyone who serves him isn't sitting on the review board. Serafina set down the teacup untouched. And sound mind or not, if those physicians decide he's demonstrated poor judgment, they can recommend removing his title regardless of actual mental fitness. That seems unjust. Justice has nothing to do with it. This is about power and who gets to keep it when someone with more influence decides they want it for themselves. The hours crawled past like wounded things. Serafina paced the entrance hall, attempted to read, and gave up after the same paragraph refused to make sense 3 times. Watched snow continue falling outside windows that made the world look like it was disappearing 1 flake at a time. Around noon, Lord Edmund arrived. He swept through the entrance without announcement, his solicitor trailing behind like a shadow that had learned to carry documents. His eyes found Serafina immediately. Lady Vale, how considerate of you to wait while your strategic alliance undergoes professional evaluation. I do hope the results don't disappoint. The results will show what we both already know. Serafina held her ground. Your nephew is perfectly capable of managing his affairs, and your petition is nothing but attempted theft dressed up as medical concern. Such confidence. Lord Edmund removed his gloves with deliberate slowness. I wonder if it will survive contact with reality. The physicians conducting today's evaluation have decades of experience identifying mental instability in aristocratic bloodlines. They'll see through whatever performance Adrian has rehearsed. Then you have nothing to worry about. Oh, I'm not worried. Lord Edmund's smile was all edges. I'm patient, because even if today's evaluation clears him, there will be others. And eventually one will find what we both know exists. A young man too damaged by family history to be trusted with power. He's stronger than you give him credit for. Strength and stability are different qualities. Lord Edmund's voice dropped to something almost gentle. You care about him. That much is obvious despite your claims of strategic alliance. So let me offer you some advice from someone who's watched this family destroy itself for generations. Walk away now, before you're caught in the collapse that's coming. The threat landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Serafina felt her hands curl into fists. I'm not walking away. Then you're a fool. And when this ends badly, as it inevitably will, remember that I offered you escape. He moved past her toward the study. The solicitor followed. Serafina stood alone in the entrance hall, feeling like she'd just lost a battle she hadn't realized she was fighting. The study door opened. Voices drifted out. Lord Edmund's measured tones mixing with responses from the physicians. Serafina couldn't make out specific words, but the rhythm suggested negotiation. Strategy. Someone working very hard to ensure the evaluation reached a predetermined conclusion. She was moving before she decided to. Across the hall, up the stairs, Down corridors she'd memorized over 3 weeks of obsessive preparation. The servant passages called to her like they had when she was a girl playing at Rebellion. The entrance behind the wardrobe in her old room still worked. Still led into darkness that smelled of dust and old wood and secrets nobody had bothered to air out. Serafina navigated by memory and desperation until she found the viewing panel that overlooked the study. Beyond the crack in the wall, Adrian sat in a chair facing 3 physicians who looked at him like he was a specimen requiring classification. Lord Edmund stood near the fireplace with the kind of posture that suggested ownership. His solicitor occupied a corner, taking notes on everything said. Dr. Whitmore held a document. Your Grace, I'd like to revisit some of the decisions you've made over the past 8 years, specifically regarding your maintenance of chambers for Lady Serafina Vale despite her prolonged absence. Those chambers represent valuable estate assets. Adrian's voice carried no inflection. Proper maintenance preserves property value and ensures readiness should circumstances change. But the expense of maintaining empty rooms for 8 years seems excessive for simple asset preservation. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, particularly given that you could have rented or repurposed the space for productive use.
The rooms in question are part of the family quarters. Adrian's hands remained perfectly still in his lap. Renting family space to outsiders would compromise security and violate centuries of estate management precedent. My decision was consistent with how every previous duke has managed the property. Dr. Whitmore made a note. And the music room? We understand you spend significant time there despite it serving no productive function for estate operations. The music room contains valuable instruments that require regular inspection to prevent deterioration. Adrian's expression remained neutral. My visits ensure proper environmental conditions are maintained and that no damage occurs that would reduce the collection's value. Serafina watched the physicians exchange glances. They didn't believe him. Or more accurately, they believed the words but not the motivation behind them. She could see it in how they documented his responses, how they nodded while their pens moved across paper in patterns that suggested predetermined conclusions. Lord Edmund cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss the more recent incident, the violent confrontation with Lord Blackwood that resulted in Adrian sustaining a gunshot wound. That was self-defense. Adrian's voice finally carried an edge. Blackwood entered my home with armed men and forged documents. Responding to armed invasion with force is neither irrational nor evidence of poor judgment, but you chose confrontation over negotiation. Dr. Pembroke spoke for the first time. A more stable individual might have attempted to diffuse the situation through dialogue rather than resorting to violence. Blackwood's men fired first. Adrian's hands were starting to shake. I defended myself and my property. That's not instability, that's survival. Physical altercations with peers of the realm demonstrate inability to manage conflict appropriately. Dr. Whitmore's pen moved across his notes, particularly when combined with other concerning behaviors. The isolation, the fixation on past relationships, the financial decisions that prioritize sentiment over pragmatism. Those aren't concerning behaviors. Adrian's voice rose slightly. They're rational responses to complicated circumstances that you're deliberately misinterpreting because my uncle has paid you to find evidence of instability, whether it exists or not. The room went silent. Your Grace. Dr. Whitmore set down his pen. Hostile accusations against the physicians conducting your evaluation are themselves evidence of paranoid thinking and poor emotional regulation. They're evidence that I understand exactly what's happening here. Adrian stood. His wound was clearly bothering him, but he stayed upright through what looked like sheer will. My uncle wants my title. He spent 5 years embezzling from family accounts, and now he's terrified I'll pursue prosecution. So he's orchestrated this evaluation and paid you to provide the conclusions he needs regardless of actual evidence. These are serious accusations. Lord Edmund's voice carried warning. I would advise against making claims you cannot substantiate. I can substantiate every word. Adrian's hands had curled into fists. I have 5 years of financial records documenting systematic theft. I have testimony from servants about your gambling debts and your mistresses and your political bribes. I have evidence that would put you in prison for decades if I chose to pursue it. And you know it. That's why you're so desperate to have me declared incompetent before I can act. The physicians were writing furiously now. Serafina could see their expressions shifting. Not toward belief in Adrian's claims, but toward confirmation of predetermined conclusions about paranoid delusions and emotional instability.
She'd seen this trap before, in her father's manipulations, in the way people with power used institutional authority to destroy anyone who threatened their control. Answer the accusations and you sound paranoid. Stay silent, and your silence becomes admission of guilt. There was no winning move except refusing to play. Adrian must have realized it too, because his expression shifted into something colder, more calculating. The tremor in his hands disappeared. "Gentlemen," his voice dropped to something that carried enough authority to stop all writing. "I understand what conclusion you've been paid to reach. I understand that nothing I say in this room will change the report you submit to the Crown. So let me make something very clear." He walked to his desk and pulled out a leather portfolio. Serafina recognized it immediately. The evidence they'd compiled over 3 weeks, every financial discrepancy, every witness statement, every piece of documentation that proved his uncle was the one who couldn't be trusted with power. "This contains proof of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy that would destroy my uncle's reputation and land him in prison." Adrian set the portfolio on the desk between himself and the physicians. "If your report recommends removing my title, I will ensure every document in this portfolio reaches the Crown's prosecutors before sunset. If your report clears me of all charges, this portfolio disappears, and my uncle's crimes remain a private family matter we'll resolve internally." "That's blackmail." Lord Edmund's voice had gone tight. "That's pragmatism." Adrian's eyes remained on the physicians. "You've already decided I'm unstable based on my uncle's testimony and your own prejudices about aristocratic bloodlines. I'm simply ensuring you understand the consequences of acting on those decisions." Dr. Whitmore looked at the portfolio like it contained plague samples. "Your Grace, threatening physicians conducting a Crown-mandated evaluation is itself evidence of understanding exactly how power works in this country." Adrian's voice cut through the protest. "You're not here to determine if I'm actually mentally unfit. You're here to provide official justification for removing someone inconvenient to people with more influence than integrity. So I'm offering you a choice. Write a report based on actual evidence, or write the report my uncle paid you for and watch his life implode alongside mine." The silence stretched thin enough to tear. Serafina watched the physicians exchange glances, watched calculations happen behind eyes trained to see symptoms everywhere they looked, watched 3 men realize they'd walked into a situation far more dangerous than a simple evaluation of aristocratic stability. Dr. Whitmore stood slowly. "Your Grace, we'll need time to review our findings and compile our report. The Crown will receive our conclusions within the week. Take all the time you need." Adrian remained by his desk. "The portfolio stays here as a reminder of what's at stake for everyone involved in this process." The physicians gathered their materials with the kind of careful precision people used when they suspected everything they touched might explode. They filed out of the study with Lord Edmund following. His expression suggested he was already planning his next move. The door closed. Adrian sagged against the desk like someone had cut his strings. His hands were shaking badly enough now that he had to grip the wood to stay upright. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the winter cold seeping through the windows. Serafina was out of the passages and through the study door before she consciously decided to move. Adrian looked up when she entered, his expression cycling through surprise and resignation and something that might have been relief. "You were watching." Not a question. Every second. She crossed to him and took his hands. They were ice cold. That was incredibly dangerous. Threatening Crown physicians with blackmail could get you arrested regardless of whether your claims are true. "I know." Adrian's voice came out hoarse. "But watching them document predetermined conclusions about my instability while my uncle stood there smirking was watching justice fail in real time." Serafina guided him into a chair before his legs gave out. "I know. I saw it. They're going to recommend removing my title." Adrian leaned back and closed his eyes. Nothing I said made any difference. They'd already decided before they arrived. Maybe. But now they know there are consequences for acting on political convenience instead of actual evidence. That might be enough to make them think twice. Or it might just confirm their conclusions about my inability to accept authority. Serafina knelt beside his chair so they were eye level. "Then we prepare for the next battle. If they recommend removal, we appeal. We submit our evidence to different authorities. The door burst open. Mr. Thorne stood in the entrance looking panicked, in a way Serafina had never seen from the usually unflappable butler. "Your Grace, you need to come immediately. There's been an incident in the village." "What kind of incident?" "Fire. The grain storage burned. 3 buildings are already gone and the flames are spreading. The magistrate sent word requesting any able men from the manor to help contain it before the entire village is lost." Adrian stood immediately, despite the exhaustion, despite the injury still healing in his side, despite having just spent 4 hours being psychologically dissected by physicians looking for reasons to destroy him. "Gather every servant who can carry water or wield a shovel." Adrian was already moving toward the door. "Send riders to the neighboring estates requesting assistance, and get word to the magistrate that I'm coming personally. Your Grace, you're injured." Mr. Thorne's voice carried concern. "Perhaps Mr. Henshaw could coordinate the—" "No." Adrian's voice allowed no argument. "This is my land and my people. I'll be there." He was out the door before Serafina could protest. She turned to Mr. Thorne. "How bad is it really?" The butler's expression went grim. "Bad enough that if they can't contain it within the hour, half the village will be ash by nightfall. And most of those families have nowhere else to go if they lose their homes." Serafina felt her chest tighten. "Get me riding clothes. I'm going with him. My lady—" Now. 10 minutes later, she was mounted on a horse she barely knew how to control, riding through snow that had turned the road into a treacherous sheet of ice. Adrian pushed ahead with Mr. Henshaw and 6 other men from the manor. None of them spoke, just rode hard toward smoke visible even through the falling snow. The village emerged from the storm like something out of a nightmare. Flames devoured 3 buildings with a hunger that made the winter cold irrelevant. People scattered in every direction, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Children screamed. Animals panicked in pens too close to the spreading fire. Adrian dismounted before his horse fully stopped. He was issuing orders before his feet hit the ground. "Form bucket lines from the well to each burning structure. Priority is containing the spread, not saving what's already lost. Anyone with shovels, dig fire breaks between the burning buildings and those still intact. Move livestock to the far side of the village green. Check every structure for people trapped inside before you give up on it." The villagers responded to his voice like it was the only solid thing in the chaos. Bucket lines formed. Men grabbed shovels and started digging trenches through frozen ground. Women herded children and animals away from the flames. Serafina found herself in a bucket line, passing water that seemed pitifully inadequate against the inferno consuming the grain storage. Her hands went numb. Her dress soaked through. Smoke burned her lungs with every breath. Beside her, Adrian worked like a man possessed, hauling water, digging fire breaks, physically pulling people away from structures that were seconds from collapse. His injury had to be screaming. His exhaustion from the evaluation had to be crushing, but he moved like neither mattered compared to keeping his people alive. This was what his uncle's physicians should have seen. Not a man fixated on past relationships or making poor financial decisions. A duke who rode into literal fire for tenants he could have sent others to save. Who destroyed his body doing manual labor he could have delegated to servants. Who prioritized survival of people with nothing over preservation of his own comfort or health. A scream cut through the chaos. Serafina turned toward the sound. A young woman stood outside a burning cottage, hysterical, pointing at an upper window. "My daughter is inside. Please, someone!" The men nearest the building looked at the flames already consuming the lower floor, looked at each other. Nobody moved. Adrian was running before the woman finished speaking. He hit the cottage door with his shoulder. Once. Twice. The third time it gave way and he disappeared into smoke so thick Serafina couldn't see 3 feet past the entrance. Time stopped. The bucket line continued, but Serafina couldn't move. Couldn't breathe, just stood frozen, watching smoke pour from every opening in the building while Adrian was somewhere inside that inferno. Seconds felt like hours. The cottage roof groaned. Timbers cracked with sounds like bones breaking. The woman who'd been screaming fell silent, her hands pressed to her mouth, watching. Then Adrian emerged through the smoke carrying a child who couldn't have been more than 5. His coat was on fire, his face streaked with soot, but the girl in his arms was conscious and breathing. He made it 10 feet from the building before the roof collapsed behind him. The sound was enormous, deafening. The cottage disappeared in an eruption of sparks and burning debris that spread across the snow like a plague. Adrian handed the girl to her mother, and then his legs finally gave out. He went down hard. Serafina was there before he hit the ground, catching him, lowering him onto snow that immediately began melting from the heat, radiating off his burned coat. "Get the doctor!" Her voice cut through the chaos. "Now!" Adrian's eyes found hers. "The girl? Safe." Serafina pulled off his burning coat and threw it aside. "Because of you. But you need to stop trying to die, proving points to people too stupid to recognize what they're seeing. Not trying to die." Adrian's words came out strained. "Just trying to do what's right."
Right almost got you killed.
She checked his side. Blood was seeping through his shirt where the stitches had torn. Because of course they had. Because he'd spent 4 hours defending his sanity and then immediately rode into an inferno to save people who'd never know he was being evaluated for mental incompetence by physicians who couldn't imagine risking anything for anyone. The village doctor arrived with supplies that looked pitifully inadequate. He examined Adrian's wounds and his burns and the general state of someone who'd spent the last 6 hours destroying himself in increments. "He needs rest and proper medical care." The doctor's voice carried frustration. "Preferably weeks ago. These burns are serious and the torn stitches will reinfect if not properly treated. Can you stabilize him here? Long enough to transport back to the manor. But your grace requires immediate attention and complete bed rest for at least... Do what you can." Adrian's voice cut through the discussion. "The fire isn't contained yet. The fire is handled." Serafina kept her hands pressed against his wounds. "The bucket lines are working and the fire breaks are holding. You've done enough." Adrian tried to sit up, failed, fell back against her with a sound that was part pain and part exhaustion so complete it had become its own injury. The doctor worked quickly, cleaning burns, bandaging torn stitches, administering something for pain that Adrian tried to refuse, and then accepted when Serafina threatened to hold him down until he cooperated. By the time they got him back to Blackthorn Manor, evening had settled into full darkness. The village had survived. 3 buildings lost but no lives claimed, and the fire finally suppressed into smoking ruins. Small mercies in a day full of disasters. They carried Adrian to his room, and the doctor spent another hour treating injuries that should have required hospitalization. Burns on his hands and forearms. The torn gunshot wound that had started bleeding again. Smoke inhalation that made every breath sound labored. "He'll recover." The doctor packed his supplies with movements that suggested he'd said this too many times, but only if he actually rests. No more heroics. No more physical labor. Complete bed rest for at least a week, or the next crisis will kill him regardless of noble intentions. He left instructions with Margaret and departed looking exhausted. Serafina sat beside Adrian's bed watching him breathe. His face was gray, his hands bandaged so thoroughly he looked like he was wearing gloves made of gauze. But he was alive. Still breathing, still stubborn enough that she knew he'd try to get up the moment she looked away. "You're staring again." Adrian's voice came out hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Getting to be a habit. Someone has to make sure you don't die of heroic stupidity. Today doesn't count as stupidity. You rode into a burning building with torn stitches and exhaustion that should have hospitalized you 3 weeks ago." Serafina heard how her voice shook. "That's the definition of stupidity. That child would have died if someone didn't go in after her." "So you appointed yourself someone?" "There were 6 other men there. Any of them could have, but they didn't." Adrian's eyes opened. Met hers. "And someone had to." "So I did. That's not heroism or stupidity. That's just what you do when you have power and someone needs help. Even if it kills you? Especially then." The words hung between them like a confession. Serafina looked at this man who'd spent 8 years building fortresses of money and influence and careful planning, who'd threatened physicians with blackmail to protect his title, who'd then immediately risked everything riding into flames because a mother's scream was more important than self-preservation. And she realized that everything they'd planned over 3 weeks, the strategic alliance, the careful reframing of sentiment as pragmatism, the performance of cold rationality for physicians looking for instability, was pointless. Because Adrian would never be the kind of duke his uncle wanted him to be, would never prioritize self-preservation over protecting people who depended on him, would burn himself down to ash if it meant someone else survived. And any physician or review board or crown authority trying to evaluate his fitness for leadership who couldn't see that was measuring the wrong qualities entirely. The crown's report will arrive within the week. Serafina kept her voice steady. Whatever it says, we deal with it together. If they recommend removal, then we appeal. And we keep appealing until someone with functional eyes looks at what you actually are instead of what your uncle claims you must be. Adrian's hand found hers. His grip was weak but determined. You should leave before this gets worse, before association with me destroys whatever reputation you have left. I'm not leaving. Serafina, I said I'm not leaving. She leaned forward until they were inches apart. You spent 8 years protecting me from truths I should have been allowed to face. I'm not letting you do it again. Whatever comes next, we face it together or not at all. Something cracked in Adrian's expression. The careful control he'd maintained through evaluation and fire and injury finally breaking under the weight of someone refusing to abandon him when abandonment would have been the rational choice. I don't deserve you. His voice barely carried. Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway. She stayed beside his bed while he slept. While night deepened into the kind of darkness that felt absolute. While snow continued falling outside windows that made the world disappear one flake at a time. Somewhere in London, 3 physicians were compiling a report that would determine whether a man's willingness to risk everything for others was evidence of fitness or proof of fatal instability. Somewhere in the manor, Lord Edmund was probably planning his next move. How to spin the village fire as more evidence of poor judgment. How to ensure the crown's decision went his way regardless of actual facts. And somewhere in the space between Adrian's breathing and her own heartbeat, Serafina felt the future narrowing to a single point where everything they'd built would either hold or collapse under the weight of institutional prejudice and aristocratic entitlement. The week would bring answers, verdicts, consequences that would reshape everything or confirm that sometimes the system was rigged too thoroughly to fight. But tonight, in this moment, with Adrian's hand still gripping hers even in sleep, Serafina made herself a promise. Whatever the crown decided, whatever Lord Edmund orchestrated, whatever price they demanded for the crime of caring about each other more than power, she would pay it. They both would, together. Because some things were worth burning for, even if the flames consumed everything else.